The BBC's Question Time examined the vexed issue of privatised water companies, the profits they make or the losses, and the amount of investment that they put into their business. The discussions seem to revolve primarily around investment, regulation, and renationalisation. Let's have a listen.
Maddie Welsh.
Is it time to renationalise Thames Water
so a life necessity is no longer monopolised by private profit-seeking companies?
Right, so Thames Water, which says, I think it's a quarter of the UK population, has been a bit of financial difficulty, as I think you all know. It secured a £3 billion loan, but at a punitive interest rate of 9.75%. And they're also trying to secure a longer-term loan in order to keep afloat.
Punitive? The average interest rate for personal loans in the UK can vary depending on factors like credit score and loan amount, but currently rates range from 12.37% for borrowers with excellent credit to more than 30% for those with poor credit. So I think Thames Water is doing very well. The average bank overdraft interest rate in the UK can go as high as 49.9%, although the average is 21.8%. Again, massively more than the interest rate Thames Water is paying on its loan, which it shouldn't have had to take out in the first place, as we'll see. Here comes the Tories' Helen Whately.
And one of the reasons why, is before my political time, but clearly things like water companies were taken out of public ownership, was because what happened every time there was pressure on government finances was that cuts would be made for things like infrastructure and things like water, because if a government's choosing between shall we spend more money on the NHS or shall we spend money on the water infrastructure, they tend to go for spending money on things like the NHS. So what we saw was underinvestment, and I know this is never a popular argument, and I'll probably get groans or boos from the audience here. And the gentleman there is already nodding his head because he knows I'm going to say that as a result of privatisation there was investment in our water infrastructure.
Oh dear, investment is it? In a little over 3 decades up to 2023, Thames Water, the biggest water and sewage company in England, serving 15 million people, transformed from a debt-free public utility, debt-free, into what critics argue is a privately owned investment vehicle carrying the highest debt in the industry. Over those years, its executives and the shareholders and private equity companies who own it presided over decades of underinvestment, aggressive cost-cutting, and huge dividend payments. The symptom of these decades can be seen in the scale of sewage discharges, the record leaks from its pipes, and the state of its treatment plants. Privatisation, which was intended to lead to a new era of investment, improved water quality and low bills, turned water into a cash cow for investment firms and private equity companies. Thames Water built up £14.3 billion worth of debt, while at the same time handing out dividends totalling £7.2 billion. How can that happen? If you've got a debt, you shouldn't be paying dividends to anybody at all. One owner, Australian infrastructure asset management firm Macquarie, took out £656 million in dividends in 2007, when profits were a fraction of that at £241 million. How it could produce any statement of profit at all is easy: borrowing. Money for equipment and day-to-day running was borrowed, while the cash paid in bills went into shareholder bank accounts. Over to Labour's Steve Reed.
So is it viable as a private company, or are you going to have to suck it up and nationalise
it? As things stand, it is viable, but we need the problem is affecting the whole water sector across the whole UK. If we were to nationalise them, it would cost over £100 billion to do that, and that is money we'd have to take out of the National Health Service, out of policing, in order to give it to the very people who own these water companies that have been polluting our rivers, lakes and seas. I don't think that's a good use of your money that you pay in taxes.
OK, well, this is not necessarily true. If Thames Water were renationalised, the government would likely need to compensate shareholders even if it was heavily in debt. This is because shareholders still hold legal ownership of the company, and compensation would be required under UK law to avoid legal disputes. However, the amount paid could be significantly reduced to reflect the company's financial state, including its debts and liabilities. Governments often negotiate what's called a debt haircut, where creditors and shareholders accept reduced payments due to the company's inability to meet its obligations. For Thames Water, with its reported £19 billion of debt now, the government could argue that the company's negative net worth justifies minimal compensation. This approach has been used in other nationalisations to balance fairness with the public interest. And now here's Fraser Nelson to repeat the falsehood about renationalisation and then go on to regulation.
I think Steve's right about the sheer amount of money you'd have to pay to its current owners to renationalise it. There are better ways of spending that money. And Thames Water has paid £7 billion of dividends over the last 32 years. So the problem there, by the way, that's 32 years of Labour and Conservative governments, needless to say. The regulator should have stopped this madness, but a toothless regulator was the main problem. You had a system that was set up to fail in the first place.
The regulator, Ofwat, was hamstrung by the framework within which it was forced to work by politicians. This framework included a focus on financial viability, so it prioritises the financial stability of water companies to ensure continuous service. This can sometimes lead to leniency in addressing mismanagement or environmental concerns. Many water companies, including Thames Water, are owned by private equity firms with complex financial arrangements. This makes it challenging for Ofwat to enforce stricter controls without risking financial instability. It has limited enforcement powers. While it can impose fines and set performance targets, its ability to enforce systemic changes is constrained. For example, fines for pollution incidents may not be sufficient to deter future violations. I think we know that's true because violations have happened after companies have been fined. And Ofwat must balance the interests of customers, investors, and environmental goals. This often leads to compromises that may not fully address systemic issues. So it's not entirely the regulator's fault. Some of it has to be put down to the politicians. So what's actually being done to improve the situation with the water companies? If Thames Water is not about to be renationalised, so Steve Reed outlined what the government is actually doing at the moment.
We've passed legislation to ban the multi-million-pound bonuses they were paying themselves rather than investing that money in fixing our broken sewage. We have ring-fenced the money that bill payers now pay so it can never again be diverted into payment for bonuses and dividends for companies that are polluting our water in the way that they got away with under the previous Conservative government. This April, on the 1st of April, £104 billion of private sector investment, the biggest ever investment in our water sector, will start flowing over 5 years. That will make a significant impact on cutting the sewage that is going into our water. And I've commissioned somebody called Sir John Cunliffe, former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, to lead a commission on how we reform regulation and the regulator so the failures that we've seen that have led to this absolute catastrophe can never, ever happen again.
Do you think that's enough, or is it time to cut our losses and renationalise again? Here's Richard Bacon with his own very distinctive point of view. And listen to the audience applause at the end.
We need water to live. It's one of the fundamental, most essential things that we need to be alive. And I think I think the government would run it better than it is being run now. It is essential that we can't live without it, and I would absolutely renationalise it.